A 17-year-old student was the only pilot on board. Both real pilots were unconscious. 300 people had no one else. She had never landed a jet before, but that night, she flew a Boeing 787 completely alone and landed it perfectly. 300 lives saved. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The airport was loud the way airports always are on Friday evenings, full of people who wanted to be somewhere else, already tired before the journey even began. Mumbai's Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj International Airport, Terminal 2, Gate 47. The clock on the wall said 8:14 p.m. Skylark Airlines Flight 447 to London Heathrow was boarding in 18 minutes. You were standing in the queue with your carry-on bag, passport in hand, thinking about nothing in particular. 9 hours. Overnight flight. You would sleep through most of it, hopefully. You had a window seat, 26F, and you liked watching the city lights shrink and disappear as the plane climbed out over the ocean. Nothing unusual. Just another Friday. Just another flight. The queue moved forward slowly. Families with too much luggage. Business travelers in expensive suits staring at their phones. A group of college students already laughing too loud. The usual mix of an international long-haul flight, 298 people all heading to the same destination for completely different reasons. You handed your boarding pass to the gate agent, walked down the jet bridge, stepped aboard the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. It was a beautiful aircraft. Modern. Quiet. The cabin lighting was that soft blue color that Dreamliners were famous for, designed to reduce jet lag. The seats were wider than older planes. The windows were larger, with electronic dimming instead of plastic shades. You found row 26, settled into 26F, tucked your bag in the overhead bin, and exhaled. 9 hours. You could handle 9 hours. You were pulling out a book when you noticed her. 17 rows ahead, seat 9C, just past the middle of the economy cabin, a teenage girl was settling into her seat. You noticed her because she was young, maybe 16 or 17, and because of what she was carrying. Not a phone. Not headphones. Not the usual things teenagers carry onto planes. She had a backpack that was clearly heavy, stuffed full, and she pulled it open even before the plane had finished boarding. Aviation textbooks. 3 of them, thick and worn at the spines. What looked like flight training manuals. A spiral notebook. A set of colored pencils. She was wearing a dark blue hoodie with white letters across the chest, National Flight Academy, Pune. Indian features. Dark hair pulled back in a tight, practical braid. Not a strand out of place. She wasn't dressed for comfort the way most passengers dressed for overnight flights, no pajamas, no oversized sweatshirt, no travel pillow. She looked like someone who had dressed specifically to work. She sat down in 9C, the middle seat, the worst seat in any row, and didn't complain, didn't look around for better options, didn't try to negotiate with the people on either side. She just sat down, opened her notebook, and started drawing. You had to walk past her row twice during boarding, once going to the lavatory, once coming back, and both times you glanced at what she was drawing. Instrument panels. Cockpit instruments. Not rough sketches, either. These were detailed, precise drawings, altimeters, airspeed indicators, attitude indicators, navigation displays, drawn from memory with a level of accuracy that seemed remarkable for someone her age. And occasionally, between drawings, she would close her eyes and her hands would move. Small, deliberate movements. Her left hand on an invisible control column, her right hand reaching toward an invisible panel, fingers pressing invisible buttons in a specific sequence. She was running simulations in her head. Practicing procedures. Flying an aircraft that didn't exist, in a cockpit she could only imagine. You thought, aviation student. One of those kids who's completely obsessed. Probably just got her first solo flight and thinks she knows everything there is to know. A teenage dreamer going to London, probably for some aviation conference. You had no idea who she was. You didn't know her name was Anya Reddy. You didn't know her father had been one of the Indian Air Force's finest fighter pilots. You didn't know she had 127 hours of real flight time at the age of 17. You didn't know that in exactly 2 hours and 43 minutes, she would be the only thing standing between 298 people and death. The boarding door closed at 8:41 p.m. The engine started, the quiet, efficient hum of the Jiang's turbofan spooling up, and Flight 447 pushed back from Gate 47 at 8:47 p.m. The aircraft taxied slowly through the Mumbai night, joining the queue for the active runway. At 9:02 p.m., Flight 447 rolled down runway 27L and climbed into the humid Mumbai sky, banking west over the Arabian Sea, heading toward its first waypoint over the ocean. In Seat 9C, Anya Reddy opened her Boeing 787 Systems Manual to page 247 and kept reading. In the cockpit, Captain Rajesh Kumar poured himself another cup of coffee from the thermos he'd brought from home. Everything was normal. For exactly 2 hours and 43 minutes. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Anya Reddy was before she ever stepped onto Flight 447. She was born in Pune, Maharashtra, the only child of Wing Commander Vikram Reddy and his wife Sunita. Her father flew MiG-29s and Su-30 MKIs for the Indian Air Force. He was, by every account, an exceptional pilot, the kind who made difficult maneuvers look easy, who other pilots watched and thought, I want to fly like that someday. He had 2,400 hours of flight time and a reputation for absolute precision in the cockpit. He also had a daughter who loved everything about aviation with the kind of pure, total devotion that only children can manage. From the time Anya could walk, she was in love with aircraft. She could identify any Indian Air Force plane by sound before she could read. She made her father describe every flight he had ever flown, in as much detail as he could remember, until he started keeping a journal just for her. She had models hanging from every surface of her bedroom, Sukhois, MiGs, old HF-24 Maruts, even a tiny paper model of a Wright Flyer that she'd made herself at age 7. You're going to be a better pilot than me, her father used to tell her. I can already see it. She was 12 years old when he died. It was a training accident, a mechanical failure during a routine exercise, ejection system malfunction, no time to recover. The aircraft went down in a field outside Jodhpur on a Tuesday morning in March. By the time the rescue teams arrived, Wing Commander Vikram Reddy was gone. Anya found out at school. Her principal came to her classroom personally, which meant she already knew something terrible had happened before a word was spoken. She sat very still and listened and said nothing. She didn't cry at school. She waited until she was home, in her bedroom, with the door closed, surrounded by all those model aircraft her father had helped her build. Then she sat at her desk and opened a notebook, not a diary, not a grief journal, and wrote at the top of the first page, everything I need to learn to become a pilot. She was 12 years old. At her father's funeral, in front of hundreds of Air Force officers in their dress uniforms, 12-year-old Anya stood up straight and made a promise she was not asked to make and had no idea whether she could keep. She spoke quietly, but clearly enough that everyone heard her. I'm going to be a pilot, Papa. The best pilot. I promise. She started studying that same week. Aviation books from the library, then purchased with money she saved from doing neighbors' chores. Online courses. Free simulator programs on the family computer. YouTube videos of cockpit procedures, watched so many times that she had them memorized. She joined every aviation-related forum she could find online and asked questions until the adult members forgot she was a child. At 15, she enrolled in National Flight Academy in Pune on a partial scholarship. Her entrance exam scores were the highest in 3 years. Her instructors expected an enthusiastic amateur who would need lots of patient encouragement. They got a prodigy. Her first solo flight came after only 8 hours of dual instruction. The academy average was 15 to 20 hours. Her instructor, Captain Arjun Mehta, told the story for months afterward. I got out of the aircraft after our 8th lesson and I said, "Anya, I think you're ready to go alone." She looked at me like she'd been waiting for me to say that since day one. She just said, "I know." And then she flew a perfect circuit and landed better than students who have 50 hours. Her instrument rating exam, a notoriously difficult test that assessed a pilot's ability to fly entirely by reference to instruments, with no outside visual references, she passed with a perfect score. The examiner sent a personal note to the Academy: "In 22 years of examining pilots, I have never given a perfect score. I'm giving one today." By the time she was 17, she had 127 hours of actual flight time and 247 hours in various flight simulators, time she paid for herself, with money earned from tutoring mathematics and physics to other students. Whenever a new simulator was available at any facility within a reasonable distance from Pune, she would find a way to access it. Including a Cessna Citation jet simulator at an aviation training center in Hyderabad, which she had visited 6 times and logged 23 hours in. The Citation was a small business jet, nothing like a Boeing 787, but it had glass cockpit instruments, it had jet engines, it had flying characteristics completely unlike the small propeller aircraft she normally trained on. She had also, in those same 247 simulator hours, practiced landing a Boeing 737 twice and a Boeing 777 once. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because it was part of her training syllabus. But because the simulators were available, and because Anya Reddy believed in a principle her father had taught her: you don't prepare for the emergencies you expect. You prepare for the ones you don't expect. Her classmates thought she was obsessive. Her instructors eventually stopped trying to keep her within the normal training curriculum and just let her study whatever she wanted to study. One of them, a retired Air India captain named Suresh Bhatt, told another instructor, "I've stopped thinking of her as a student. I think of her as a junior colleague who happens to be 17 years old." She read accident investigation reports the way other people read novels, not for entertainment, but to understand exactly what had gone wrong and exactly how to prevent it. She could describe the sequence of events in Air India Flight 182, Korean Air Cargo Flight 6316, Colgan Air Flight 3407, and dozens of others, including not just what happened but what each pilot should have done differently at each critical moment. She was, in short, the most prepared 17-year-old pilot in the world. She was also the daughter of a man she missed every single day, preparing for the moment she could look up at the sky and feel, in her bones, that she had become what she promised him she would become. On November 8, 2024, she boarded Flight 447 to London for the Asia-Pacific Youth Aviation Conference, where she was scheduled to speak about young women in Indian aviation. She chose Seat 9C because it was near the front of economy and she could, if she was lucky, get a glimpse through the open cockpit door when it was briefly opened. She opened her Boeing 787 systems manual and read about emergency descent procedures. Just in case. Because that was who she was. 2 hours and 43 minutes into the flight, Flight 447 was cruising at 41,000 feet over the Arabian Sea, 340 miles from the nearest land. In the cockpit, Captain Rajesh Kumar was feeling slightly unwell. This wasn't unusual in itself. Long-haul pilots often felt tired or mildly uncomfortable on overnight flights. He had 18,000 flight hours accumulated over 30 years of flying. He had flown when he was exhausted, when he was coming down with colds, once when he had a mild fever that he probably shouldn't have ignored. Small discomforts were normal. You flew through them. But this wasn't small. The nausea hit him suddenly, like a wave breaking over a wall. There was nothing and then there was everything, his stomach revolting with a violence that left no room for any other sensation. He had time to think, this is bad, this is very bad, before the world tilted sideways and he lost control of it entirely. "Priya," he managed. "I don't feel." He couldn't finish the sentence. He vomited, violently, and then darkness closed around him like water closing over a stone. First Officer Priya Sharma was reaching for the emergency medical kit when she realized her own hands weren't working properly. The kit seemed to be getting further away, not closer. She had thought she was fine, she had declined the coffee from the captain's thermos earlier, had stuck with the cabin coffee instead, and hadn't understood why he was suddenly collapsing, but 20 minutes ago she had accepted a single sip when he offered again, just to be polite, and now she understood. She tried to call for the cabin crew. The intercom button was right there, 3 inches from her hand, but her fingers felt like they belonged to someone else. Cabin, medical, Emmer. She was unconscious before the word was finished. The Boeing 787 flew on. The autopilot didn't care that both pilots were slumped forward over the instrument panels. The autopilot cared about altitude and heading and speed, and all 3 of those things were exactly where they were supposed to be. From the autopilot's perspective, everything was perfect. The aircraft continued west at Mach 0.84, 41,000 feet, on a perfectly calculated track across the Arabian Sea. In approximately 48 minutes, it would reach a navigation waypoint called Nadka that required a pilot to manually confirm the next leg of the route. If no confirmation was received, the autopilot would default to a holding pattern, a large racetrack circuit in the sky, and the aircraft would fly that circuit, perfectly and endlessly, until the fuel ran out. At current fuel burn, that would take approximately 3 hours and 17 minutes. 298 people would not die dramatically. They would not die in a crash or an explosion. They would simply run out of fuel, slowly, somewhere over the Indian Ocean, and the engines would go quiet one by one, and the aircraft would begin a long, silent glide toward the black water far below. No one in the cabin knew any of this. Senior Flight Attendant Mira Kapoor, 28 years old, 6 years with Skylark Airlines, was in the front galley preparing the second service when she noticed that the cockpit hadn't responded to her last intercom call. This wasn't immediately alarming, pilots were sometimes occupied, sometimes had their headsets off, but when a second call also went unanswered, a cold finger of unease moved through her. She walked to the cockpit door. Knocked. Called, "Captain Kumar, everything okay in there?" Nothing. She knocked harder. "Captain? First Officer Sharma?" Silence. Mira had been an air hostess for 6 years and had been trained for approximately 40 different emergency scenarios. None of those scenarios had ever actually happened to her. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who has memorized emergency procedures until they're automatic, exactly what she was supposed to do. She entered the emergency override code. The cockpit door opened. She had exactly 2 seconds of normal before she saw them, both pilots unconscious, slumped over the controls, the instruments showing an aircraft flying perfectly through the night with nobody at the wheel. Her training kicked in so completely that she later couldn't remember making any conscious decisions. She checked both pilots for breathing, they were breathing, both of them, which meant this was medical incapacitation, not something worse. She grabbed the radio and told Mumbai Center there was an emergency without specifying what kind. She looked at the autopilot status, engaged, stable, all systems green. Then she looked at the clock. Then she picked up the passenger address microphone. Her hand was shaking. She breathed in once, breathed out once, and pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Senior Flight Attendant Mira Kapoor. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Both pilots are unconscious. If there is anyone on board with pilot experience, military, commercial, private, any flying experience at all, please identify yourself immediately." She released the button. The aircraft flew on in silence for exactly 3 seconds. Then the cabin exploded. In seat 26F, your seat, time seemed to stop. You heard the words. Your brain processed them, both pilots are unconscious. You understood what that meant. And yet some part of you refused to accept it, kept waiting for a follow-up announcement, some explanation of how it was all under control, how there was a procedure for this, how professionals were handling it. But no follow-up came. Around you, people were crying. A woman in 24A was praying loudly in Hindi. A man somewhere behind you was calling someone, his wife, maybe, or his mother, saying words you didn't want to hear. Children were crying without fully understanding why. The cabin was chaos, noise and fear and the awful certainty that something was very wrong and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. You gripped the armrests of 26F and stared forward and tried to think. Then you saw her. She appeared between the seats, seat 9C, 17 rows ahead, and she was calm in a way that made her stand out from every other person on the aircraft like a lighthouse in a storm. She closed her notebook with a deliberate movement. She picked up her backpack. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a click that you somehow heard over all the noise. She stood up. People grabbed at her as she moved toward the front. There was a man who seized her arm and said, "Where are you going?" "Sit down," and she looked at him and said something quiet and he let go and stepped back. An older woman reached out and touched her shoulder and Anya, though you didn't know her name yet, gently moved the woman's hand aside without breaking stride. She walked to the front of the aircraft with the contained focus of someone who had been preparing for this moment their entire life. Mira Kapoor saw her coming and held up a hand. "Sweetheart, you need to sit down. This is an emergency." "My name is Anya Reddy," the girl said. Her voice was clear and even. No shake in it, no panic, no bravado. Just information, delivered precisely. "I'm a student pilot at National Flight Academy in Pune. I have 127 hours total flight time including 23 hours in a jet simulator with glass cockpit systems similar to the 787. I have never flown anything this large. I have never flown a commercial aircraft. I have never landed anything heavier than a Cessna 172. She paused. "But I know how autopilot systems work. I know how to read these instruments. And I know that in approximately 43 minutes this aircraft is going to enter a holding pattern that will eventually kill everyone aboard unless someone takes control. I'm not qualified for this. I'm probably going to fail. But I'm the only person on this aircraft who has any chance at all." Another pause. "So you can either let me try, or you can sit here and wait to die. Your choice." Mira stared at her for 3 full seconds. She was looking at a 17-year-old girl in a flight school hoodie and a braid. She was looking at a child. She was also listening to the screaming from the cabin behind her, and thinking about the 2 unconscious pilots ahead of her, and doing the brutal mathematics of impossible situations. "You're certain?" Mira said. "No," Anya said. "I'm not certain at all. But I'm certain that nobody else on this aircraft can do this. So I'm your only option. Now open that cockpit door before we run out of time." Mira opened the door. Anya stepped into the cockpit of the Boeing 787 and did something that no one who watched her would ever forget. She didn't freeze, didn't gasp, didn't hesitate. She looked at the cockpit the way a musician looks at an unfamiliar piano, respectfully, assessing, already planning what she would play. She moved Captain Kumar's unconscious body carefully back from the controls, made sure he was stable, checked his breathing. Same with First Officer Sharma. Both breathing steadily. Medical emergency, not cardiac. Good. Then she slid into the captain's seat. Her feet didn't quite reach the rudder pedals naturally, the seat was adjusted for a man who was 6 feet tall, and she took 15 seconds to adjust it without being asked, without needing to be told. She fastened her harness. Put on the captain's headset. Scanned the instruments. Altitude, 41,000 feet. Speed, Mach 0.84. Heading, 295 degrees. Autopilot, engaged. Fuel, 47% remaining. All flight systems, green. Navigation, on track for waypoint Nadka, time to waypoint 43 minutes. Aircraft is stable, she said, for Mira's benefit. Autopilot is flying. We have approximately 43 minutes before the waypoint issue. I need to contact air traffic control immediately. She keyed the radio. Mumbai Center, Skylark 447. Skylark 447, Mumbai Center, go ahead. The controller's voice was professional, routine. Mumbai Center, Skylark 447, declaring emergency. Both pilots are unconscious due to food contamination. I am a student pilot, 17 years old, 127 flight hours total. I am currently the only person on board with any aviation training. I need priority handling and I need it now. A pause. Skylark 447. Say again. Did you say student pilot? Affirmative. Student pilot. My name is Anya Reddy, I'm from National Flight Academy in Pune. I need vectors back to Mumbai and I need emergency services standing by. Do you copy? Another pause, slightly longer this time. Anya watched the clock on the instrument panel. She could not afford long pauses. Skylark 447, stand by. Mumbai Air Traffic Control Center. The controller who had been handling Flight 447 was a young man named Deepak, 3 years in the job, who had spent those 3 years handling routine traffic and had never declared a major emergency. He turned to his supervisor, Karan Singh, 15 years in air traffic control, who had seen more unusual situations than most, and said, "Sir, I have a 17-year-old student pilot flying a 787. Karan Singh came to the console in 6 steps. Skylark 447, this is Mumbai ATC Supervisor Karan Singh. Can you confirm your situation? Confirmed, Anya said. Both pilots are unconscious. I am the only person aboard with flight experience. I need assistance immediately. I have approximately 40 minutes before this becomes significantly more complicated. Karan Singh had been in air traffic control for 15 years. He had handled diversions, medical emergencies, technical failures, and once an aircraft that had lost most of its hydraulic systems. He had never handled anything like this. He made his decision in approximately 2 seconds. Skylark 447, we're with you. What do you need? I need current weather at Mumbai. I need vectors for a straight-in ILS approach to your longest available runway. And I need you to get me a Boeing 787 systems expert on this frequency. Someone who can talk me through the systems I haven't studied. Can you do that? Working on it, Karan said. Stand by. He picked up his phone and called the number that linked him to the airline's operations center, and from there to Boeing's customer support line in Singapore, and from there, in 7 minutes and 42 seconds, to a conference room in a Singapore hotel where a Boeing senior training captain named Michael Hayes was attending an industry conference. Captain Michael Hayes had been flying for 31 years, teaching Boeing 787 systems for 9 of them. He had trained over 300 pilots on the aircraft. He answered the call, listened to a 2-sentence summary of the situation, said, "Patch me through immediately," and walked out of the conference room in the middle of a presentation about fuel efficiency. Skylark 447, this is Captain Michael Hayes, Boeing 787 instructor. I'm being patched to your frequency now. I'm here to help you land this aircraft. Anya heard his voice and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, not relief exactly, but the knowledge that she was no longer entirely alone. Captain Hayes. Thank you for coming on. What do you need from me? First question, can you read the flight management computer? Yes. I've studied the FMC interface in simulators. I'm looking at it now. Second question, can you disengage the autopilot? Yes. But I'm not doing that until absolutely necessary. The autopilot is flying better than I can right now. There was a brief silence on Hayes's end, and then his voice returned with something slightly different in it, not surprise exactly, but a reassessment. That is the correct answer. Okay. We're going to get you on the ground safely. But I need to ask you directly, have you ever landed a jet aircraft? I have 23 hours in a citation jet simulator. Never a real jet. Have you ever landed anything heavier than 5 tons? No, sir. The heaviest aircraft I've actually landed is a Cessna 172. Approximately 1,100 kilograms. And you're going to land an aircraft that weighs 227,000 kilograms at landing weight. Yes, sir. I'm aware of the weight difference. A pause. Anya. Hayes's voice was direct, steady, honest. I'm not going to pretend this is easy. This will be the hardest thing you have ever done. But I have trained 300 pilots on this aircraft, and I am going to talk you through every single step. Do you trust me? Anya thought about her father. About a man who had climbed into aircraft more dangerous than this one for 20 years, who had trusted his training and his instruments in his own hands, who had told her, in the air, you only have what you know and what you trust. Make sure you know enough. Make sure you trust right. Yes, sir, she said. I trust you. Good. Then let's bring these people home. In seat 26F, you could hear everything. Mira had patched the radio communications through the aircraft's PA system, a decision she made without being asked, on the theory that 298 terrified passengers would be less terrified if they knew what was happening than if they were sitting in silence imagining the worst. She was right about this. The cabin had gone from chaos to an intense, concentrated quiet as people listened to the voice of the girl in the cockpit. A 17-year-old voice, talking about flight management computers and descent rates, precise and calm. Mumbai Center, Skylark 447 requesting descent. Current altitude 41,000 feet. Request descent to 10,000 feet in preparation for approach. Skylark 447, descend to 10,000 feet at your discretion. Runway 27L available, 14,000 feet, winds 260 at 8 knots. You have priority handling. Thank you. Descending. You gripped your armrests and felt the aircraft's nose tilt slightly downward as Anya Reddy, 17 years old, student pilot, began to bring 227,000 kilograms of aircraft down from the cruising altitude of 41,000 feet. In the cockpit, Hayes was walking her through each step. On the FMC, I want you to select VNAV. Then select descent. Target altitude 10,000 feet. Descent rate 1,500 feet per minute. Selecting VNAV. Selecting descent. Setting target altitude 10,000. A pause. Descent mode engaged. Descent rate 1,500 feet per minute. Aircraft descending. Perfect. Now I want you to leave the autopilot engaged and let it fly the descent. Your job right now is to monitor. Check speed, check altitude, check the FMC is following the planned route. Tell me if anything looks unusual. Understood. They flew in silence for 3 minutes. Anya watched the altimeter unwind, 40,000, 39,000, 38,000. Speed stable. Heading stable. All systems green. Then Hayes said, you adjusted the descent rate about 90 seconds ago. Why? I noticed we were slightly high for the planned descent profile. I corrected for it. I know. I saw you do it. My question is, how did you know to do that? I've run this approach in simulators. Citation simulator, different aircraft, but the same principles apply. When you're high on profile early, you need to increase descent rate to get back on track before you get too close to the destination to fix it. If you wait too long, you have to either dramatically steepen the descent, which is uncomfortable for passengers and hard to manage, or you overshoot the approach and have to go around. I didn't want to deal with either problem. Another silence from Hayes. Longer this time. You've practiced landing a commercial aircraft in a simulator. I've practiced landing every aircraft I could find in every simulator I could access, Anya said. Because I knew someday I might need it. Or because I wanted to be prepared in case I did. Your father, Hayes said quietly. Wing Commander Vikram Reddy. I was given your file. He flew Su-30s. Anya's hands tightened on the control column for just a moment. Yes, sir. He was one of the best. You are your father's daughter, Hayes said. Now let's bring this bird home. Passing through 25,000 feet, Hayes began the approach configuration briefing. I want to walk you through what we're going to do step by step, and I want you to repeat it back to me so I know you understand. This is called a briefing. Commercial pilots do it before every approach. Are you ready? Ready. Good. We're going to intercept the ILS, Instrument Landing System, for runway 27L at Mumbai. The ILS will give you two guidance needles on your flight display, a vertical needle showing you left and right of the runway centerline, and a horizontal needle showing you above or below the correct descent path. Your job on final approach is to keep both needles centered. If a needle moves, you correct toward it. Understood? Understood. Approach speed at your current landing weight is 145 knots. That's going to feel very fast compared to what you're used to. The Cessna you trained on lands at about 60 knots. But 145 knots is correct for this aircraft at this weight, and the aircraft is designed to land at that speed. Trust the numbers. Trust the aircraft. Don't try to slow down below VREF. 145 knots, VREF, trust the numbers. Understood. Landing gear, deploy on intercepting the glide slope. 3 green lights confirm gear locked down. If you get anything other than 3 green, tell me immediately. Understood. Flaps, we'll go to flaps 30 for landing. I'll call each flap extension. Follow my calls. Understood. Touchdown, aim for the first third of the runway. The aiming point markers, 2 white rectangular bars on each side of the centerline about 300 meters from the threshold. At 50 feet above the runway, I'll call flare. You pull back gently, this is not a Cessna, small inputs, to reduce the descent rate, let the main gear touch first. Then nose gear down, deploy thrust reversers, full braking. Understood. Any questions? 1, Anya said. What happens if I land long? If I cross the threshold with too much speed and touch down too far down the runway? Then you do a go-around, Hayes said. Increase power to full, raise flaps to 20, establish a positive climb, and come back around for a second approach. How much fuel do we have for a go-around and second approach? A brief pause. Enough for 1. Maybe 2 if we're efficient. You have options if you need them. Good to know, Anya said. Thank you. In row 12, seat 12A, a woman named Priya Desai was sitting with her 6-year-old son Arjun. Arjun had been frightened during the initial announcement, had cried a little, but had been listening to the radio transmissions with the focused attention of small children who know something important is happening. Mama, he said. Is a kid flying the plane? Yes, Beta, Priya said. Is she good? Priya looked toward the front of the cabin, toward the door behind which a 17-year-old girl was doing something that seemed impossible. She listened to the voice on the PA, steady, precise, professional, and she thought about what she had heard over the last 20 minutes. I think she might be very good, Beta, she said. I think she might be the best pilot on this aircraft. Passing 10,000 feet, Anya called speed and altitude and Hayes began the approach sequence in earnest. Speed 250 knots. Reducing to 210. Flaps 5. The aircraft slowed. The nose pitched slightly up as the flaps extended, changing the wing's aerodynamic profile, increasing lift at lower speeds. Flaps 5 confirmed. Speed coming back to 210. Good. Flaps 10. Flaps 10. Extend landing gear. Anya reached for the gear lever, a large mechanical handle on the center console, impossible to confuse with anything else, and moved it to the down position. The sound was extraordinary. Deep mechanical thuds and hydraulic groans as 3 massive landing gear assemblies rotated down and locked into position below the aircraft. The drag was immediately noticeable, a slight deceleration and nose-up pitch. 3 green lights illuminated on the gear status panel. Gear down. 3 green. Perfect. That's exactly what we want. Now flaps 15. Flaps 15. Approach speed will be 145 knots on final. Start slowing. Reducing speed to 145 knots. Mumbai Center was on the radio, Skylark 447, turn right heading 310. You're 10 miles from the ILS runway 27L. Cleared for ILS approach runway 27L. Wind 260 at 8 knots. You have the runway. Turning right 310. ILS 27L. Cleared. Anya banked the aircraft, still on autopilot, making the input through the autopilot's heading selector rather than manually, and watched the navigation display show the aircraft turning to align with the runway approach course. I'm looking for the localizer needle, she said. It'll come in from the right as you turn to intercept the course. Watch for it. The needle swung. Centered. Localizer captured. Good. Now the glide slope. Watch for the G/S indicator, it'll come up from below, indicating you're below the glide slope, and as it rises towards center, you begin your descent. Watching for it. 30 seconds of silence. The aircraft descended through 4,000 feet, 3,500, 3,000. Glide slope alive. Rising toward center. When it centers, begin descent. Glide slope centered. Descending. Flaps 30. Full landing configuration. Flaps 30. The aircraft settled into its final configuration, gear down, full flaps, speed 145 knots, descending at approximately 700 feet per minute down the invisible electronic slope that led to the runway 8 miles ahead. In the cockpit, Anya was working harder than she had ever worked in her life. Not physically, the control inputs on a 787 were surprisingly light, but mentally. She was monitoring 7 different instruments simultaneously, cross-checking them against each other, making small corrections to heading and speed and descent rate, doing mathematics in her head about where she was on the approach profile versus where she should be. The aircraft was heavier than anything she had ever flown, and she could feel the difference in the way it moved, slower to respond, more stable in some ways, more massive in others, like the difference between steering a bicycle and steering a bus. Both were steering. The physics were completely different. 5 miles from runway, ATC called. Altitude 2,500 feet. On glide slope. Looking good, 447. 3 miles. 1,500 feet. 2 miles. 1,000 feet. Hayes said, "You're going to see the runway in about 20 seconds. When you have it visual, I want you to disconnect the autopilot and hand fly the last section. Small inputs. Trust the aircraft. You've done this part 100 times in simulators. This is just a bigger aircraft. Copy. Anya. Yes, sir. Trust yourself. You have prepared for this your whole life. You are ready for this. Trust yourself." A pause. Shorter than you might expect. "I see the runway." The runway lights of Mumbai's runway 27L stretched ahead like 2 parallel lines of fire in the darkness, impossibly beautiful, impossibly real after 9 miles of black ocean and black sky. Anya's right hand moved to the autopilot disconnect button. She pressed it. The aircraft was hers. The first thing she noticed was the weight. Not heavier in the way a car is heavier than a bicycle, this was a different sensation entirely, the sensation of 227,000 kilograms of aircraft responding to her inputs with a slight, dignified delay, like a very large, very confident animal acknowledging your direction and choosing to follow it. She made small left inputs. Small right. Feeling the aircraft. Assessing its responses. 1 mile, ATC called. 500 feet. Speed 145. You're on glide. The runway was rushing toward her now. At 145 knots, 269 kilometers per hour, distances compressed rapidly. The threshold lights were visible, green and white, marking the beginning of the landing surface. The approach lights were ahead, the sequence of white strobes that lit in series to guide pilots onto the runway like arrows pointing home. "Looking good, 447, ATC said. "Stable approach. Continue." In the cabin, you had your eyes closed. You couldn't watch. You could feel the aircraft descending and you could hear the engines at a different pitch and you could hear people around you praying and crying and holding each other and you had your hands pressed together and were doing something you hadn't done since you were a child. 500 feet, Hayes said on the PA, "Stable approach. Keep it coming." The runway filled Anya's windscreen. The lights were blazing. The threshold was close. 200 feet. Looking beautiful. Small inputs. 100 feet. She could see the aiming point markers, the two white rectangular bars on each side of the runway centerline, exactly where Hayes had said they would be. 50 feet. Hayes's voice was quiet and steady, "Begin flare. Gently. Small pull back." Anya pulled back on the control column. Gently. A tenth of the input she would have used on a Cessna, because the 787 was 150 times heavier and responded proportionally. The nose came up. The rate of descent decreased. The runway seemed to float up to meet her. 30 feet. 20 feet. 10 feet. The main gear touched the runway at 142 knots. The impact was harder than any landing she had ever made, of course it was, 227,000 kilograms landing on a concrete runway at 263 kilometers per hour created forces she had never experienced in training, but the aircraft stayed on the runway, tracked straight, and after the first jarring contact settled into a firm, controlled roll. The nose gear came down seconds later. "Thrust reversers." Hayes called. Anya pulled the thrust reverser levers. The engines roared in reverse, a different sound entirely, using their thrust to help slow the aircraft instead of accelerate it. Full brakes. She pressed both brake pedals to the floor. The aircraft decelerated. Hard. Runway passing underneath, 2,000 feet. 3,000, 4,000. The speed coming down. 100 knots. 80, 60. 40. At the 7,000-foot marker, the aircraft stopped moving. On the runway. Safe. Anya released the brake pedals. Her hands were shaking. Her entire body was shaking. She became aware that she had been holding her breath for the last 30 seconds and she exhaled, and it came out as something between a breath and a sob, and she pressed her eyes shut. "Skylark 447, Hayes said, his voice not entirely steady either. "Welcome to Mumbai." In the cabin, the sound was impossible to describe. Every one of the 298 passengers, 298 people who had been, 30 minutes ago, calling their families to say goodbye, was making some version of the same sound. Crying and laughing simultaneously. Applause that had no direction because there was no stage, just a sealed metal tube in which everyone was alive and not everyone had expected to be. In seat 26F, you opened your eyes. The runway lights were streaming past the window, then slowing, then stopping. You were alive. Tears on your face. You didn't remember them starting. In row 12, Arjun Desai said, simply, "She did it, Mama." And his mother, who had been holding him so tightly he would have bruises the next day, said, "Yes, Beta. She did." The emergency response was immediate and overwhelming. Fire trucks surrounded the aircraft before it had fully stopped rolling. Ambulances were positioned at the runway edge. Airport police. Medical teams. Ground handlers who had been briefed during the approach and who stood in the darkness and watched an aircraft land that they had not expected to see land. Paramedics boarded and went directly to the cockpit. Captain Kumar and First Officer Sharma were removed on stretchers, both breathing, both stable, both completely unconscious. They would be taken to hospital, treated for severe bacterial food poisoning, and would wake up the next morning with no memory of anything after 11:15 p.m. They would also learn, lying in hospital beds, that a 17-year-old student pilot had brought their aircraft home. In the cockpit, Anya sat in the captain's seat and didn't move for a long time. Mira appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were red, which was the only external sign of the last hour that she allowed herself. "You did it," she said. Anya opened her mouth and closed it again. She nodded. "Is there anything you need?" Anya looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, the adrenaline had nowhere to go, was just running through her system like electricity looking for a ground. She thought about what she needed. She thought about her father. "A minute," she said. "I just need a minute." Mira nodded and stepped back. On the radio, Hayes's voice, "Skylark 447, this is Captain Hayes. That was the finest first jet landing I have ever witnessed in 31 years of aviation. Not the smoothest, you could work on your flare timing, but the finest. How do you feel?" Anya laughed. It surprised her. The laugh came out shaky and real and she pressed her hand over her mouth and collected herself. "Terrified," she said. "Exhausted. Relieved. You should feel proud. You just saved 298 lives." She looked at the cockpit around her. The instruments still glowing. The city lights visible through the windscreen. The cockpit that her father had always described as the best place in the world to be. "I just did what the situation required," she said. "No," Hayes said gently. "You did what Anya Reddy does. And Anya Reddy is going to be a name that every aviation authority in the world knows by tomorrow morning." He was right about that. By midnight Mumbai time, the story was on every news channel in India. By 3 a.m., it was global. By morning, every major news network in the world had some version of the same headline. 17-year-old student pilot lands Boeing 787, saves 298 lives. Teen aviation prodigy, the incredible story of Anya Reddy. How a 17-year-old daughter of fighter pilot saved Flight 447. Her face was everywhere. The flight school hoodie. The practical braid. The expression in the photograph someone had taken of her stepping off the aircraft, exhausted, yes, but something else too, something harder to name, the look of someone who has done the thing they were afraid they couldn't do. Her instructors at National Flight Academy gave interviews in which they were careful to say that she had exceptional ability and exceptional preparation, while also being clear that what she had done was extraordinary and should not be interpreted as evidence that student pilots could routinely land commercial aircraft. Captain Arjun Mehta said, "She is not a normal student pilot. She may be the most prepared student pilot I have ever trained. What she did requires not just skill but a kind of mental strength that very few people have." The Directorate General of Civil Aviation, India's aviation regulatory authority, conducted a formal investigation. Their findings, released 3 weeks later, were unambiguous. Anya Reddy's actions had been appropriate given the circumstances and had directly prevented the deaths of all 298 people aboard Flight 447. No regulatory violations. Special commendation issued. 2 weeks after the landing, Skylark Airlines CEO came to National Flight Academy personally. He brought photographers and press releases and a formal offer, a full scholarship for commercial pilot training, and a guaranteed first officer position with Skylark Airlines the day she turned old enough to hold a commercial license. Anya heard him out, sitting in the same chair in which she had sat for hundreds of hours of ground school, and then she said, "Thank you. I'm honored. But I need to finish my current training first. My father always said, finish what you start. I'll contact you when I'm ready." The CEO shook her hand and said he would wait as long as necessary. Captain Michael Hayes flew from Singapore to Mumbai 4 weeks after the landing. He came to the academy, where Anya met him in person for the first time. He was a tall man, gray-haired, with the slightly weathered look of someone who had spent 3 decades sitting on the wrong side of a windscreen looking at the sun. They shook hands. Neither of them knew exactly what to say for a moment. "I wanted to thank you in person," Anya said finally. "Without your guidance, I couldn't have done it." "Without you, 298 people would be dead," Hayes said. "I gave you information. You had the skill, the preparation, and the courage to use it. Those came from you." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out something small. A patch, the Boeing 787 type rating insignia, the kind that qualified 787 captains wore on their uniforms. "You haven't technically earned this," he said. "You don't have the hours. You don't have the simulator training. You haven't passed the official type rating check ride." He paused. "But in my professional opinion, having watched you fly that approach from 7,000 miles away and then studied the flight data recorder afterward, you have earned this more than anyone I have ever trained." He held it out. Anya took it. Looked at it for a long moment. "I'll earn it properly," she said. "I'll do the hours and the training and the check ride. But I'll keep this until I do." Hayes smiled. "I expected you to say something like that." 6 months later, on a warm evening in Pune, National Flight Academy held its annual graduation ceremony. The main hall was full: families, instructors, current students, aviation officials, journalists who had received press passes in numbers the academy had never seen before. Sunita Reddy sat in the third row, in a light blue sari, with a framed photograph of a man in an Air Force uniform on the seat beside her. The chair wasn't empty. Wing Commander Vikram Reddy was present in the only way he could be. Anya's name was called last. She walked across the stage in her formal academy uniform, white shirt, gold epaulets, the kind of uniform that said "I have not yet arrived but I am on my way." The academy principal handed her her commercial pilot license certificate, shook her hand, said something into her ear that made her smile. She held the certificate up. The audience applauded, the full audience, not just the families of graduates, but everyone in the hall, for longer than graduation ceremonies usually run. Afterward, on the flight line, in the golden evening light, her instructor Captain Mehta pointed to a Cessna 172 sitting ready on the tarmac. "Where to?" he asked. "Just up," Anya said. "I want to fly." She climbed in. Started the engine, the familiar sound of it, the small 4-cylinder chatter that was so completely different from the jet she had flown 6 months ago, and somehow all the more dear for it. She had learned to fly an aircraft like this one. They were home. She taxied to the runway. Did her checks. Called the tower. Golf Papa Kilo ready for departure. Golf Papa Kilo, clear for takeoff. She pushed the throttle forward and the small aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted cleanly into the Pune evening sky. She climbed to 3,000 feet and banked west. Toward Mumbai. Toward the Arabian Sea. Toward the place where, 6 months ago, a Boeing 787 had carried 298 people through the night and a 17-year-old girl had brought it home. She flew for 20 minutes without speaking. Just her and the sky and the sound of the engine and the feeling, that specific feeling she had been chasing since she was 12 years old, sitting at her desk with a blank notebook, of being exactly where she belonged. Then she looked out at the horizon where the sun was setting, orange and red and gold, the way it always set over the western sea. "I did it, Papa," she said quietly, to the empty sky, to the man who had taught her everything and then left before he could see her do it. "I'm a pilot now. A real pilot." The Cessna flew on through the evening air. "And I'm just getting started." The investigation into the contaminated thermos concluded that Captain Rajesh Kumar's thermos had been left in a warm car for approximately 6 hours in Mumbai heat before being refilled, sufficient time for bacterial contamination to develop to dangerous levels. New Skylark Airlines regulations required cockpit crew to use only airline-provided beverages on long-haul routes. Captain Kumar and First Officer Sharma both returned to flying after full medical clearances 6 weeks later. The flight data recorder confirmed that Anya Reddy's approach and landing had been, by every measurable technical standard, well within acceptable commercial parameters. The Boeing 787 suffered no damage beyond minor brake wear and ordinary tire were consistent with a firm landing. It was returned to service after routine inspection. Mumbai ATC supervisor Karan Singh was promoted to regional supervisor. In an interview, when asked about the incident, he said, "My job that night was to help a 17-year-old girl land an aircraft. Once I understood that was my job, the rest was simple. She was not asking for rescue. She was asking for information and support. There's a difference." Captain Michael Hayes retired from Boeing 2 years after the incident, citing that he had reached a natural stopping point in his career and could think of no more fitting way to end it. He teaches aviation at a university in Washington state. He has told the story of Flight 447 to every class he has taught since. Anya Reddy received her ATPL, Airline Transport Pilot License, the highest pilot certification available, at the age of 20, the youngest Indian woman to hold one. She joined Skylark Airlines as a first officer on their medium-haul routes at 22. She became a captain at 26, one of the youngest commercial captains in Indian aviation history. She kept her father's photograph in her flight bag for every flight she ever flew. She also kept the Boeing 787 type rating patch that Captain Hayes gave her on the night she graduated. She earned the official one 2 years after that. It went right next to the first one. For Wing Commander Vikram Reddy, and for all the pilots whose daughters watched them fly.